Okay, everybody, please take your seat. And the next presentation here in the green room, we will receive Peter Mackenzie and Andrew Brandt with the presentation behind the scenes of the SamSam ransomware. Andrew is here with us, and we will present. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you. So I have to apologize to the audience because my co-presenter, Peter Mackenzie, was not able to attend, so I will be presenting alone today. And I also should, at least at the beginning, mention that it was Peter Mackenzie and Dorka Pelote, who was one of our top reverse engineers, who did most of the research on this project. And we really hold all of them in esteem. I was just the last guy standing, basically, to do the presentation. So really the kudos belong to them. But I'm going to talk a little bit about SamSam and how we did some of the investigation that led to it. We published a big report about SamSam, its behavior, how they collect their payments, tracking the attackers, and understanding their modus operandi in a big report that got published in August. And the report links are here, including some follow-up blog posts and other reports on what we're calling targeted ransomware, which is the term that we're using for the type of attack that we're discussing. So what's SamSam? So in many ways, in many respects, it's a conventional ransomware that we've seen a million times, but it does have certain characteristics that are unique. One of them is the very high cost of recovery. So many ransomware will charge between a few hundred and maybe a few $1,000s. The SamSam ransomware was charging upwards of 7 Bitcoins to restore the machines that had been encrypted, and that is very, very high compared to most other ransomware. So how does the attack work? I'm going to just kind of rush through this as quick as I can. Essentially, the attacker or attackers, we don't know exactly how many are part of the SamSam group. It could be one or a very small number of people. We suspect that it's a small group of people, max, because they have had incredibly good OPSEC. They're not bragging about it on dark markets or dark forums. They're just getting the job done and collecting the cash. And really, the only criteria that they seem to have is, can the target pay? They have attacked large organizations like hospitals, government agencies like the City of Atlanta, but they've also attacked smaller groups like homeless charities and other organizations like that. And really, they just care about whether they can get the target to pay them. They're conducting their attacks using a extremely manual, extremely brute force method. They have been, for most of the time that they have been doing this, using just brute force attacks against remote desktop. And then in the earlier days, they were also targeting servers that were running software called JBoss. And that particular server had a few vulnerabilities, and there were some exploit tools, and they were just using these exploit tools to break into servers and use that as their foothold into the corporate network. Once they're in, they're elevating their privileges using tools like Mimikatz to sniff for administrator passwords. And eventually, when they would get an admin password, they would use those credentials to use conventional Windows sysadmin techniques to distribute the malware simultaneously to all active machines on the network. And then, boom, they were done. It would start encrypting, and all they had to do was sit back and wait for the victims to come and pay. And come and pay they did. So let's talk a little bit first about the malware, and then we'll talk a little bit about the collection of payments. So this little chart just kind of details our understanding of the development process of SamSam. This was part of the report. In general, there were 3 major versions of SamSam. We're in the middle of version 3 right now. Its earliest iterations were discovered at the end of 2015, and we didn't see the very first attacks until January 2016. So in that time, they have gone through these multiple revisions. In the earliest days of the ransomware, they were doing experimentation to find what's the best methods of protecting themselves themselves and masking and preventing researchers from doing analysis. By the second version of the malware, we started to see that they were adding garbage code and starting to encrypt strings and adding new features to sort of thwart analysis. And by the third version, they had refined this even further and changed their methods to make it even harder to do the analysis. But a dedicated reverse engineer was able to get through it. Really, the biggest thing that we noticed was that just in the days before we released our report on this, and we had been tracking this group and contacting the victims directly to get information from them, we saw that for one attack, they changed their file suffix that they used to append to all their encrypted files to .sophos, which was, I guess, a kind of notification that we're on to you. But then they switched that over to something Nike 2018 right after that, and I think they've used that ever since. So as I mentioned, they had sort of over time improved their OPSEC. They started in this early version by just kind of encoding strings as base64, and then they started to encrypt the strings using AES, and they started adding this garbage code and other things to thwart analysis and send us off on a wild goose chase. And then by the third version, we started to see this thing called the runner, which was essentially a dropper that would deliver the payload. It was embedded encrypted inside the dropper, and it would decrypt and drop the payload that was the ransomware executable. And then they started to sort of segment out components of the malware, including the decryptor, into separate libraries that they would also bundle into the dropper. The dropper would do things like you'd have to invoke a batch file with a password as a flag in order to run the ransomware. So it became very difficult. Even if you had the executable, you could pull it out of VirusTotal or some other repository. You couldn't actually run it unless you had this batch file and the password that goes with it. Right. So the way that they do their encryption is sort of designed to maximize the amount of damage that they can do. So in addition to sort of creating a sort of a text extension list of all the targeted files that are the first ones that they want to hit, once they have run through all those things, which are all the usual suspects, documents, office documents like Excel spreadsheets, images, movies, and everything you could imagine that a normal ransomware would target, it doesn't stop there. So it has this hard-coded list of paths and files that are whitelisted, and those are essentially the minimum requirements for a Windows machine to maintain operational status and not crash. So they are not encrypted. And then the system will look at everything else that's on the hard drive, all the programs, all the configuration files for those programs, other data files, databases, organize them by size and go from smallest to largest and encrypt all of those in sequence from smallest to largest so that it does eventually get everything. And what this does is it results in a machine that basically is unusable until you re-image the machine back to a clean image and put those programs back and then bring back the data from a backup. So everything takes much, much longer to restore. I think the victims start to realize and have a panic attack, and that's when they decide that the cost of the ransom, being between $30,000 and $65,000, depending on the value of the Bitcoin that week, is probably worth it compared to the enormous amount of lost productivity and time, and just the cost of replacing a lot of equipment or getting it back up and running in a short amount of time to keep business operating. So, how did we find the victims? Well, in some cases, it was easy because we knew who they were. There were many high-profile targets. As I mentioned, there were government targets, there were targets in healthcare, and targets in education. And some of these victims included things like the City of Atlanta and the Colorado Department of Transportation, which is the state where I live, and some hospitals and other healthcare providers. And what we found was that these companies and organizations had basically publicized the fact that they had been hit with ransomware. In some cases, they identified that it was SamSam. In other cases, we were able to deduce that it was SamSam based on what they described. But these groups were basically a small percentage of the victims. In fact, they were fewer than half. Here are some of the distribution of the victims around the world, and you can see that the majority of them essentially were in the Anglosphere, meaning the English-speaking part of the world. U.S., Canada, Great Britain were really kind of in the top. Australia was in there as well, and then there seemed to be a relatively high percentage in Belgium. There may be some institutions in that country which cater to English speakers as well, and people from those countries. There are so many more victims. So one of the things that we realized early on is that each victim would, when the ransomware would display the ransom note, the ransom note was unique to each victim. The unique things in the ransom note were the onion address that pointed to a page where the victim could go to transact the conclusion of this business proposition from these people. And there was also a unique Bitcoin payment address for each victim. And when we started Googling for the text of these ransom notes, we found a whole lot more of them, in some cases on public web servers where the web server had been a victim and the ransom note and the encrypted files were still on the web server and they'd been indexed by Google and been there for a really long time. And that was actually kind of amazing to discover. And then the next thing we started to do was track payments that had gone from those known Bitcoin addresses. And that was actually very interesting. And what that revealed to us was that the total number of victims was more than double what the organizations that had publicly announced that they had been victimized, and that all of the companies or organizations that had not announced who they were essentially private companies, and they still, many of those victims have still never acknowledged the attack. So who are these groups that were the silent victims that didn't want to really talk about it? Well, they're in the energy sector, financial services, manufacturing. You can see the list here. I don't need to read them all, but they span the gamut of large businesses and organizations that you can imagine would be able to pay, which is really the only criteria. I suppose one other criteria was that they had to be running Windows machines and that those Windows machines had to be part of their business, but I think that's kind of a given. So we identified roughly 90 victim organizations. This was in some cases through these searches, in some cases because we contacted them directly. Our research eventually revealed that there were roughly 230 victims that paid ransom, and that those who didn't identify claimed that it was just computer problems or some kind of an attack, but they didn't actually specify SamSam. And some other vendors, including Cisco Talos and our partners in the Cyber Threat Association, also shared some information with us, and that was very valuable to help us find even more. And in the end, all of the research that we were able to do was essentially dependent on these partners giving us their information or anything that they could tell us about the ransomware, because without that partnership and that trust between those victims and us, we would never, literally never have been able to get things like the runner and the passwords and the samples to be able to do the testing and reverse engineering that we did. So we're very grateful to those organizations that shared that information with us. All right, let's talk a little bit about the payments. So this is our chart that we derived from tracking payments over the roughly 21, 22 months from the time that we started doing the research until the report came out. You can see that the end of 2016 was sort of the banner month for these guys. They got 19 payments in 1 month. That must have made a very nice Christmas for whoever this was. And as I mentioned, all the payments had been done through Bitcoin. So all the payments were to unique addresses. And then 157 of those addresses had been used as of the time that the report came out. There may be a few additional that just didn't make it into this presentation that have happened subsequently. All of those payments essentially went into one of 3 wallets, and the wallets, they didn't exactly parallel the 3 versions of the ransomware in timing, but it kind of seems like it's an interesting connection that basically that there were 3 of them that received all these payments. Now, I am not an expert in tracking Bitcoin transactions, but my understanding of this is that once you understand what the payment address is and the wallet is, you can then follow and track the blockchain to be able to see how they distribute these payments around and try to do the money laundering that hides the destination or the eventual recipient of them. And that is essentially how we did that tracking. These guys were making tons of money. So over time, the ransom demand stayed relatively the same. I think it fluctuated in the amount of Bitcoin just a bit as the price of Bitcoin changed. But you can see that gradually over time, the trend line was that they were trying to make more money with each subsequent transaction. And it did kind of bounce up and down, but it did get there. Right up until, I guess, their peak payment that they received was earlier this year for almost $52,000. So how do they hide the way that they transact this cash? There are all these different ways that you basically launder cryptocurrency, right? So there's these tumbler services which essentially break out the payment into hundreds or thousands of fractional cryptocurrency segments, and then they trade those around, and then those get broken up further and swapped around even more. And it's literally like throwing your clothes in the dryer, and then they come out, having been spun around at the end with very little. It's not easy to track back through those hundreds or thousands of transactions and those lots and lots of little pieces. Then they were also trying out converting from Bitcoin to Monero and other digital currencies, and they were using these things called mixers, which basically substitute Bitcoin for other kinds of currencies that are not tradable in invisible ways, and then trading them back into tradable Bitcoin later on. And they were actually using all 3 of these methods interchangeably and sometimes all at the same time in order to mask these transactions. So this is our calculation of how we came to the when I submitted this talk, it was almost $6 million, and then on Black Hat Day 1, they collected enough payments that they had actually topped $6 million. So thankfully, we got the Steve Austin joke in there in the opening slide. But the idea here is that they were making bucket loads of cash, and I mean this was just unheard of amounts of money in this short of amount of time for doing this kind of a ransomware attack. With the sort of the top take being in December 17, where they made about $500,000. Okay, so who is the SamSam threat actor? We still don't know. We are aware that it's probably a small group of people. We are aware that there are certain people that are part of this team that seem to have specialization in unique tactics and techniques, and so that's why we kind of think that there's a small group instead of just a single guy, although it could very well be a single, very, very skilled programmer and social engineer and customer support specialist, but they do all of these things. The person is probably proficient in English, but not a native speaker. I'll explain a little bit about that later. And they have, as I mentioned, very good OPSEC. There has been no bragging, no claiming of buying large yachts and fancy cars and posting pictures of themselves on Facebook with their ill-gotten gains. They've just basically been making a bunch of money and keeping real quiet about it, which is probably the safest thing for them to do. The way that the attacker operates when a victim is hit is that they send this link, right? And it's a Tor link to an Onion site that the attacker runs. It's actually basically like a message board or communications board. When a victim is hit, they're able to send a message to the attacker, and in near real time, the attacker will actually message them back, which is actually kind of interesting. So that in a couple of cases, we were able to obtain screenshots from victims when they had been engaged in a conversation back and forth with the attacker, and I'm going to share you a screenshot of that now. And yeah, the attacker is clearly very technically competent and a complete sociopath. So here's a screenshot that was given to us by one of the victims. We've masked out all the details to hide the identity of the victim. But the gist of it is that basically the victim would post a comment on the left, the person would respond on the right. And in fact, one of the sort of hallmarks of SamSam has been that the customer service of these guys is actually pretty good. That when you have finally paid your 7 Bitcoins and you're ready to decrypt your entire network all at once, if there's any kind of problem with the decryptor, they will actually work with you to make sure that you can get your files back. So I gave a presentation similar to this one last week, and there was a question that was asked, have they ever struck the same victim twice? And to our knowledge, they have not, but that doesn't mean that they couldn't. I think that they just move on and go to the next target after this. Again, we're talking about a small group, and I think if they were to re-victimize the same victims multiple times, they might find it more difficult to collect payment. But that is just a guess. All right, so some of the things that we know about the attackers is that, again, they are not super great English speakers, and they do have these written tics that they kind of, repeat over and over again in their communications, and also in the ransom notes as well. And some of them is that you can see that there's some pretty obvious spelling and punctuation errors, and this is just characteristic of someone who's just not English is not their main skill, and that's probably okay. One of the other weird things that we noticed that's just a characteristic of this person is that they always seem to treat a comma as though it's the same as a period, and so they kind of capitalize, they put a space and a capital letter after it every time. And it's just a sort of unique behavior that we see both in the ransom notes and in the chats that we've managed to obtain screenshots of. Just a strange thing, and clearly it's someone who doesn't understand the purpose of this punctuation, and that clearly doesn't affect their ability to earn money. That was the entirety of my presentation. I do need to thank Peter and Dorka because it is really all of their work that we relied on to be able to do this presentation. And we did have a lot of partners from other organizations who shared with us information about the victims, the ransom notes, the Bitcoin addresses, and we're very grateful to all of their for all of their help. And we would ask that if anyone here also would like to collaborate with us, we are open to collaborating with you on future research of this type, and specifically with these targeted ransomware campaigns. We are tracking a new type of targeted ransomware campaign called Ryuk, which is seeming to use the same methodology as SamSam. And interestingly, SamSam has gone relatively dark in the last couple of months, unsurprisingly perhaps because of the report that kind of called a lot of attention to them. But yes, if you're interested or you have information that you can share with us, we are happy to work with you, so please reach out to me. And I would like the audience to give me 2 questions before I jump off the stage.